Hello, my name is Alex Hidalgo, and I am a historical sociologist. My heavy research experience comes in the areas of the U.S. color line and racial wealth inequality. Using my expertise, I'll be reviewing Michelle Kuo's Reading with Patrick, which was recently published on July 11th of 2017. The 336-page piece of nonfiction is written in the form of a memoir, with Kuo recalling her experiences and challenges teaching in the Arkansas River Valley. It was clear to me from the start that Kuo had two main goals in writing this book. The first of which was to raise awareness for the bleak state of education in Helena, detailing the utter lack of resources available to school children. This is one of the poorest districts in the United States, with a majority Black student body and very few opportunities for employment. In writing Reading with Patrick, Kuo attempted to shine light on this, demonstrating how the color line and racial wealth inequality impacts this as well. The second goal of Kuo's was to convince the reader of how many people are a product of their environment. Patrick is a perfect example of a bright student struggling to learn in an impoverished district, setting him up for challenges throughout life. To go along with this, the reader is to realize how a history of racism through the color line, as well as racial wealth inequality, have contributed to Helena's poor conditions. To give proper context and dive a bit more in depth, I'll detail key points from parts 1 through 4 as I summarize Reading with Patrick. Part 1 contains the introduction all the way through Chapter 3 and begins with Kuo explaining her own feelings of alienation as a child of immigrant parents. These feelings, and coming from a background in which she could also be judged unfairly for how she looked, led to Kuo aligning herself with the Black freedom struggle. Kuo does a great job of contextualizing the history of Helena, where the persistence of segregation is intertwined with this history. Kuo illustrates the bleak state of its school system and talks about her first months at STARS. She struggled both to relate to her students and to trust them, and the students exhibited similar feelings. Kuo also didn't know how to teach them their history, as evidenced by the episode in which she introduced the photo of a lynching. Kuo approached the story of Black people in the Delta as a lineage of pain and suffering, and the students had no interest in hearing more of this. As the memoir progresses, Kuo gets a better grasp of the conditions that predetermine her students' lives. One problem is the cynicism of her Black elders, who have come to expect failure from the children. Part 2 includes Chapter 4, which focuses on Kuo's struggle between taking the easy route with a well-paid job or using her degree to help others. After Kuo made what she initially thought was the right decision by taking a job at a law firm, she remained torn between where she could be the most useful. Her choice to return to Patrick reveals that activism is a personal action for Kuo. Patrick's helplessness in response to both a failed school system and later an underserving legal system made it imperative for Kuo to teach him how to understand the world in which he lived. Part 3 is the lengthiest section of the book, as it includes chapters 5 through 10. In this section, Patrick is now a grown man, hopelessly giving up on his abilities to make something of himself when Kuo re-enters his life. Kuo begins heavily working with Patrick while he's in jail, giving him lessons in grammar and literature to help him focus outward and feel unstuck. The reading of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the first step in getting Patrick unstuck, as it enabled him to imagine possibilities, even imaginary ones, outside of a jail cell. Kuo offers broader context as we learn of Patrick's father, who is an ex-convict himself. We also learn about Patrick's ignorance as a result of revisionist history, with Patrick not knowing when the Civil War started or who Frederick Douglass was. Part 4 includes the final chapter, which is about both Kuo and Patrick moving on with their respective lives. Kuo settled into the law career of her choice, finally at peace with not living up to others' expectations. Meanwhile, Patrick educated himself by performing the work to get his GED and re-entered the world. Kuo realizes that the circumstances that led Patrick to leaving school were out of her control, as well as Patrick's brief slip into drugs and alcohol. They part ways, and Kuo realizes that Patrick's battle of re-entering society will be his own to fight. At this point, I'll evaluate the content of Reading with Patrick using my sociology proficiency. To reiterate, Kuo's two main points in writing this were: one, to raise awareness for educational inequalities in America, and two, demonstrate the profound effect of the environment on success. Kuo wove in anecdotal experiences, including the lack of educational resources in Helena, and provided historical evidence, defining the history of the area and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that followed. As a well-read historical sociologist, I was able to connect much of what Kuo was saying to my past studies. To begin, Kuo's contextualization of the Arkansas River Valley was reminiscent of Alex King's description of the South in Race Problems of the South, Old Southern Values. King described how white Southern farmers valued segregation, viewing Black people as a danger to society. Kuo showed the lasting implications of this, with Helena's public schools being 99% Black. DeSoto, on the other hand, the town's private school, had never matriculated one single Black student. This lasting segregation between schools shows vast educational inequalities in the South, and how this mindset described by King from white Southerners still lives on. Another point made by Kuo dealt with Helena's Black population being held down by historical racism. Kuo gives an anecdote where a 16-year-old boy, whose brother had been killed by a white man while he was robbing a flower shop, walked up to Kuo's poster of Dr. King at the March on Washington. The boy observed the sea of white protesters and accused Kuo of posting something fake. He didn't believe that so many white people would ever be interested in helping Black people. This reminds me of Rachel Rand's Interracial Intimacy, where she talks about historical sustaining of the color line and to keep Blacks in their proper place. This is clearly reflected by the boy's response to the poster of Dr. King, where he simply cannot fathom white people actually wanting to help Black people. To further expand on this past racism in the color line, Kuo shares a story about Miss Riley, a teacher's assistant at STARS. Miss Riley talked nostalgically of segregated life. The community, she argued, had been more intact and children had more respect for their elders, while integration had unraveled Helena's moral fabric. It's this very mindset that Fox and Guglielmo touch upon in defining America's racial boundaries. Miss Riley unknowingly is fueling the evidence behind the bright boundary that Black people face today, a boundary that promotes segregation and suppresses the upward mobility of Black people. This is consistent with the US color line, as Miss Riley longs for color separation under the Jim Crow laws. While when Kuo visits Helena's Confederate cemetery, she is again reminded of the distinct color line. In the cemetery, described as by far the nicest public space anywhere in Helena, she found monuments dedicated to former rebels, honoring them for their dedication to the proverbial lost cause. These men who fought for segregation were heralded as heroes. This is very similar to what we saw in the film You Belong to Me, where the racist history of Live Oak, Florida is revealed through the chokehold of the KKK. In both cases, the violence enacted to suppress Black liberties and to preserve the color line by the Confederate Army and the KKK are celebrated and idolized. Moving on to the topic of racial wealth and equality, we see this firsthand poverty permeating the 70% Black population in the Helena community, which is one of the county's poorest and ranking last in Arkansas for public health. Teenage pregnancy was higher there in the early 2000s than it was in 94 developing countries. Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists encapsulates this perfectly, showcasing the vast inequalities between Black and white wealth. Bonilla Silva writes that Blacks and dark-skinned minorities are 3 times more likely to be poor than whites, providing insight into Kuo's description of the downtrodden state of Helena. In the book, Kuo describes Patrick's yearning yet inability to take his case to trial, as racism and poverty would make it a futile effort. Both Kuo and Patrick's lawyer knew that Patrick would likely be unable to claim self-defense the way so many whites did. Both his race and his father's criminal record would no doubt prejudice a jury against him. Waquance, From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, connects with this point from Kuo about the clear racism and unfairness of the criminal justice system. Waquant writes that slavery is intertwined with today's mass incarceration of Black people, with a history of unpaid labor and lack of financial resources plaguing Black Americans like Patrick. When visiting Patrick in prison, Kuo stumbled upon the severity of the wealth gap between them as she showed him pictures from her visit to Indiana on her smartphone. Patrick absolutely marveled at the device. This was Kuo's world, yet Patrick's was so distinctly different. Patrick told Kuo about the things that went on in the jail. He said that inmates burned the plastic coverings of the windows to smuggle in marijuana. This dichotomy between Patrick and Kuo showed just how different their lives had been as a result of wealth and environment. In the article, The Case for Reparations, Coates talks about how common this divide in wealth is. Coates laid out this in a timeline, which included figures like 90 years of Jim Crow and 35 years of racist housing policy. With Coates showing this history of oppression, we can better understand how Patrick is a product of a racist system of economic suppression. This wealth gap was reinforced again when Kuo's former student Aaron discussed how other past students had been doing. Aaron told Kuo of Tamir, who was a homeless crackhead in Little Rock. He went on to talk about Miles, who had a habit of shooting at people and did little else. Many of the girls, Jasmine, Kayla, and Cassandra, had children. Kuo wondered why Aaron had done better than so many of his classmates. She mused about how his family was better educated and had more resources. His mother was an administrator at a nursing home, and his grandmother owned a sewing shop downtown. Oliver and Shapiro and Black Wealth and White Wealth speak to this, emphasizing the importance of education while displaying a growing number of Black people suffering from educational deficiencies. Aaron was lucky enough to have wealth already in his family and was a clear exception among his classmates who were all struggling to make ends meet. Overall, I thought Reading with Patrick was a truly enlightening read. Michelle Kuo didn't hold back personal criticisms or any mistakes she made along the way, and I think both Kuo and Patrick greatly benefited from their experiences with one another. The biggest strength of Reading with Patrick to me was the way Kuo framed the history of Helena. Kuo didn't just talk about the town being poor and all the horrible crimes that occurred there. Rather, she gave the entirety of the issue with the history of segregation and slavery that hampered these people. When it comes to weaknesses, there was nothing glaring, but I wish Kua went more in detail for how we can actually help individuals living in these conditions. One of Kua's big takeaways was the negative circumstances, such as the jailing of Patrick, were totally out of her control. While I agree with this, I wish Kua still gave a message of what more not only she could do, but what well meaning Americans could do to help this issue. With that being said, Reading with Patrick still carries a phenomenal message and changes the way we think about the color line in America. At least for me, growing up in a privileged environment with an amazing public school, reading this has allowed me to better understand the need for further reform to the educational system. I also was better able to recognize how a history of racism can truly penetrate into a community. I'd recommend this book to just about anybody, as it contains a truly important message. But in particular, I'd recommend this book to those who think race doesn't matter in the US. I have family members who talk about racism being a thing in the past, and I think this book shows how its history still lives on in the US today. In conclusion, Kuo effectively showed how the color line and racial wealth inequality are still very prevalent in America, and she gave firsthand accounts to prove this. To wrap things up, the four syllabus sources I used from units 1 and 2 are Race Problems of the South, Old Southern Values by Alex King, Rachel Moran's Interracial Intimacy, Fox and Guglielmo's Defining America's Racial Boundaries, and the film You Belong to Me. My four syllabus sources from Unit 3 include Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists, Waquant's From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, Coates' The Case for Reparations, and Oliver and Shapiro, Black Wealth and White Wealth.